So let's do this. Cool. So first, let's talk definitions. How do we define violence? The World Health Organization defines violence as the intentional use of force, power, threatened, or actual against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. The CDC, on the other hand, has a different definition or a more specific definition for youth violence. And that definition is harmful behaviors that can start early and continue into young adulthood. The young person can be a victim, an offender, or a witness to the violence. Our work here kind of complicates and critiques these definitions. So the book primarily works with the CDC definition, but we'll be making it a little bit more complicated because we want to understand more and we want to be able to critique the material more. So critical questions to ask. As I said, the CDC definition will serve as a starting point for our inquiry, but it's not the only way to understand violence. Part of our work together, as I said, is to complicate and critique dominant definitions by getting to ask some questions. Who gets to define violence? Which forms of violence or which forms of harm are named and which are ignored? Who is labeled as violent and who is treated as a victim? So I want us to kind of have these questions at the forefront of our mind as we have these discussions. Now, from a Hooks perspective, we're not just defining violence in abstract terms. We're locating it within systems of domination. As Hooks reminds us, the classroom is a space where we can challenge the knowledge that has been used to uphold oppression. So when we talk about violence, we're also talking about how violence is taught, whose pain is legible, and whose bodies are policed and punished. So this is like, guys, this is the space, like you're not at work, um you're not attempting to uh live up to some sort of, this is the place for us to have these questions and to challenge these understandings, right? The classroom is the space to do that. And then pulling in a little bit from Andrea Ritchie. I'm not pulling from any of Andrea Ritchie's books. This is more of like my education coming into play. I think Andrea J. Ritchie offers like a lot of really cool insights into criminalization and to understanding how youth are primarily criminalized. So you'll see me pulling a lot of her material into this, but there's no book that I'm using. It's all like in my head, but I'm happy to provide resources on Andrea Ritchie if that's something that is beneficial for you guys. So Andrea J. Ritchie, writing about the criminalization of Black girls specifically and queer youth, urges us to look closely at the language used by institutions, right? So for instance, the CDC categorizes youth as victims, as offenders, or witnesses. But Ritchie would tell us push back against that, right? What does it mean to label a child as an offender? How does that label become a gateway to policing, incarceration, or surveillance? What kind of structural violence, for example, like poverty, like racism, like transphobia, go unnamed in these institutional definitions that we're using? Now, beyond institutional definitions, we're going to be examining, yes, absolutely, we're going to be examining how violence affects victims, how it operates through bystanders, and what motivates young people to engage in violence. But we'll also ask questions, we'll also demand answers, right? What kinds of harm are made invisible by state institutions? And what happens when violence isn't physical, but systemic? When it's emotional, when it's institutional. So we'll be considering, when we talk about violence, we'll be considering chronicity, pardon me, severity, and type. So violence may occur as a single act, or be repeated over a lifetime. Many children experience what we call polyvictimization, so meaning multiple forms of violence across different domains. So across sexual, that would be sexual abuse, assault, community violence, state violence, warfare, civil disputes. This definition or this understanding of polyvictimization, it also includes acts that would be considered crimes between adults. But remember, not all violence is criminalized. So for instance, two siblings hitting each other may be violent, but it's not a crime. It's rarely labeled as a crime. And that distinction between what is criminal and what is harmful is exactly where Ritchie pushes us to pay attention. So criminalization is not neutral. It often reflects power, it reflects race, it reflects gender, and the state's priorities. It's not a consistent or just application of harm prevention. So the physical impact of violence can range widely from no visible injuries, as in emotional abuse or psychological bullying, to severe physical harm or death. That's what the book says to us. But Hooks pushes back against us and teaches us that harm is not only physical. Emotional and psychological wounds, especially those shaped by systems of domination, can be just as profound and often go unacknowledged in mainstream definitions. So naming these forms of violence is a part of education and is a part of practicing freedom in the classroom, where we can learn to see what is being deliberately hidden. We'll be examining several typologies of violence, not as rigid categories or exclusive categories, but as sort of a scaffolding or a starting point for a critical engagement. And I welcome you guys to push back against these definitions or to say, like, this doesn't make sense, or this isn't enough, or this doesn't cover certain definitions. Also, I'm fostering a cat, and her hair, her fur is everywhere, on my face, in my mouth, in my drink, everywhere. So you'll see me picking at my face a lot. So the first definition that we're going to be looking at is situational violence. So this violence occurs in response to immediate environmental factors. So for example, the presence of a weapon, the presence of alcohol, other drugs, or certain group dynamics, right? Think certain gang behaviors. Hooks would ask us to consider how certain communities are systematically overexposed to these situations through segregation, through poverty, through under-resourced schools. And Ritchie would push us even further to question the situational label at all. And she would say that it obscures the role of state-created environments. So saying something is situational makes us forget about policing, about surveillance, about carceral school discipline systems, and producing these conditions that we speak of. Our second form of violence would be relationship violence. So this emerges from interpersonal conflict, often in homes, in schools, in peer groups. And Hooks reminds us that oppressive socialization, so including patriarchal ideas of masculinity and dominance, they shape how young people navigate conflict. So what looks like individual dispute is often learned behavior and learned power dynamics. And Ritchie warns against framing relationship violence as a purely private matter. So when the state intervenes selectively, policing in Black or undocumented households, it often punishes rather than corrects or protects. Another form of violence that we're going to be talking about throughout the next few weeks is predatory violence. So this describes violence that is committed for material gain. So this is an example, a classic example of this would be robbery. But again, I push back against this using Hooks and Ritchie. What drives the need for gain in the first place? Hooks teaches us to interrogate capitalism's role in shaping survival strategies that are then criminalized. And Ritchie emphasizes how predatory language is used disproportionately to describe Black and Brown youth, even when the conditions of scarcity are created by systematic abandonment. So by under-resourced areas, lack of access to resources and tools, and so on. And then we have psychopathological violence. And this is attributed to underlying mental illness or personality disorders. This form of violence is relatively rare. I know that it's like sensationalized, especially in like true crime circles, where like this notion of psychopathology, and like right now in the news, the Bryan Kohberger case is like taking over, but it is a relatively rare form of violence. And Hooks warns us against the temptation to medicalize violence in ways that depoliticize it. So turning systematic suffering into individual pathology. And Ritchie, on the other hand, critiques how this framing often reinforces ableism and is used as a way to weaponize and justify surveillance and institutionalization or even forced treatment. And we particularly see this for queer, trans, and disabled youth of color. Now, the final two forms of violence that I want us to keep in mind are instrumental versus reactive violence. So instrumental violence is goal-oriented. So it's using force to assert control or obtain something, whereas reactive violence is an emotional or instinctive response to provocation or threat. So rather than seeing these as opposites, Hooks pushes us to ask, what emotional realities are silenced when we label youth behavior as simply instrumental? And I think that's a question that we should consider. Ritchie would add on to this, when young people respond to violence in their environments, why are their reactions criminalized rather than contextualized? And again, these are just questions for us to ponder over and ways for us to think about the world. Ultimately, what I want us to do in this course, what I want our work to be in this course, is to move beyond rigid categories and to see violence not just as something young people do, quote unquote, but as something they are formed within, right? Not within themselves, but within the context and the environments that they exist in. These typologies, they offer us language, but we have to stay alert to how that language can reproduce harm if left unexamined. Hooks reminds us the classroom is where we practice seeing clearly, loving deeply, and resisting domination, even in the words we use with one another. Now, as far as our assignment goes, I want you guys to start pondering on it. I don't want you to start writing, Friday morning or write Friday morning. It's up to you. I've been there, done that, whatever. But I would like it if you begin pondering about what you want to write about today. So as we begin this course, our as I said, our goal isn't just to memorize types of violence or recite official definitions, it's to interrogate them and to understand how they show up in our lives, in our communities, in the systems we're part of. And the definitions we reviewed today from the CDC, from the WHO, from public health frameworks, they're institutional narratives, right? They carry power, they shape policy. They describe which harms are seen as public health crises and which are treated as criminal acts. But Hooks reminds us our classrooms must be spaces where we question dominant knowledge and center our own voices, our own stories, and our own insights. Now, our assignment prompt. So our first assignment asks of you, how have you come to understand violence? How have you come to understand youth violence particularly? Which forms of violence have touched your life, your community, or your imagination, even if they're not named by institutions, even if it's not one of the things that the CDC listed or one of the things that the WHO listed? How have they touched your life? How have they impacted you? Are there forms of harm that you were taught to normalize, minimize, or ignore? Think environmental harm. Think harm in poverty-ridden neighborhoods. Think policing, think surveillance. Are there forms of harm that you were taught to normalize, minimize, or ignore? And finally, what does it mean when youth are labeled as violent, but the conditions they're reacting to go unnamed? So what does it mean when youth exist in poverty-ridden, police-surveilled, under-resourced, horrific conditions, and they react to those conditions, but the conditions that they react to are going ignored? How do we name violence in that instance? Ritchie's critique of criminalization is key here. She challenges us to see how the labels offender or predator are shaped by race, they're shaped by class, they're shaped by gender, sexuality, and systemic abandonment. So when you're reflecting, ask who is positioned as dangerous in the stories you've been told about youth violence, and who is positioned as worthy of protecting. This assignment isn't just writing a personal essay instead of doing critical analysis. It's about bringing the two together. So you are both writing a personal essay and you are critically analyzing this material. You are already an expert on your own lived experience. I cannot come in and tell you how you've lived your life and how you've experienced it. But I am asking you to situate that experience within larger systems of meaning and power. Now, just a final note. Let your writing be bold, let it be layered, let it be unfinished. I will be offering feedback. I will be offering my insights as we go along. You don't need answers. We just need better questions. And I will leave you with Hooks' saying, naming the problem is the beginning of imagining what is possible. So we are just starting in this course. I think it's going to be awesome if we just kind of stick together and write together and experience this together. And yeah, that's where I'm going to leave you guys today. I know we kind of wrapped really quickly, but I don't really like using the entirety of the course time when it comes to uh, online courses. And I will hang out here and answer any questions that y'all may have. Noad, if you want to stick around, we can talk a little bit. But otherwise, yeah, shoot me an email, shoot me a message if you have questions, and we're done for today, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.